Paul Williams's possible return could change everything in Genoa City. Rumors of Paul Williams returning to Times the Young and the Restless Times have been spreading rapidly across social media. And although no official confirmation has been made, the possibility feels more believable with each passing day. Fans have heard return rumors before, so caution is understandable, but this time the circumstances appear to be different. The show seems to be entering a new creative phase. Old misunderstandings behind the scenes may finally have been resolved, and the departure of the previous writing leadership could have opened the door to repairing decisions that disappointed longtime viewers. A new writing team does not simply need louder twists, more shocking confrontations, or temporary cliffhangers designed to create attention for a single episode. It needs credibility, emotional history, and characters who can reconnect the present version of Genoa City with the stories that made the show powerful in the first place. Paul is exactly that kind of character. He is not merely a familiar face who could appear for a brief, nostalgic visit. He is a respected investigator, a former police chief, a man with decades of complicated relationships, and one of the few people whose presence could immediately influence both the emotional and legal sides of the current crisis. If the new writers truly want to create a significant increase in interest and viewership, bringing Paul back would be more than fan service. It would be a strategic decision capable of restoring a sense of history while giving the ongoing Patty and Markham storyline a stronger, more logical direction. Paul has always carried a special kind of authority in Genoa City because his strength did not come from wealth, corporate power, or the ability to control others through fear. His influence came from experience, instinct, discipline, and a willingness to search for the truth even when that truth threatened someone he loved. That is why he remains so difficult to replace. Other characters may investigate crimes, make accusations, or use private information as leverage, but Paul understands how to construct a case, how to read a suspect, and how to recognize the difference between a convincing story and an honest one. He has also made serious mistakes, and those mistakes are important because they prevent him from becoming an unrealistically perfect hero. His history with Patty has always forced him into impossible moral territory. She is his sister, but she is also someone whose actions have repeatedly caused terrible damage. Paul has faced the painful conflict between protecting his family and protecting the people endangered by Patty's instability. If he returns now, he cannot arrive as a simple rescuer who immediately solves everything. He would have to confront the possibility that his absence allowed old patterns to return, that Patty may once again have been manipulated, and that Markham may have used her vulnerability to carry out a much larger plan. Paul would come back carrying guilt, not because he is responsible for every crime Patty committed, but because he may believe he should have recognized the warning signs sooner. That guilt could become the emotional engine of his return. He would not only be investigating Markham, he would be trying to correct his own failures, prevent Patty from being manipulated further, and stop her from destroying the lives of Jack, Diane, Kyle, and everyone else caught in the chaos. The timing of Paul's return would be especially powerful because the current situation has become too complicated for ordinary suspicion to solve. Patty and Markham have not simply created one isolated incident. They appear to have constructed a web of fear, false testimony, emotional manipulation, and carefully positioned evidence. Jack's attack has shaken the entire Abbott family. Diane has faced suspicion and possible legal consequences, and Kyle has been pushed toward increasingly desperate actions because he believes the system is failing both of his parents. Michael can challenge the accusations in court. Christine can examine weaknesses in the prosecution's case, and the Abbotts can search for contradictions, but none of them possesses Paul's complete understanding of Patty. He knows her habits, her emotional triggers, her ability to combine truth with delusion, and the ways she can be influenced by someone presenting himself as a protector. Markham may believe he has designed the perfect arrangement because Patty is both useful and unpredictable. She can be directed toward a target and then blamed when the plan collapses. Yet Paul would immediately recognize the contradiction. He would know that Patty is capable of making dangerous choices, but he would also recognize when her words do not sound like her own. He might notice a phrase she repeats that originally came from Markham. a detail in her statement that she could not have known without being coached, or an emotional reaction revealing that she is more afraid of Markham than loyal to him. These small observations would allow the story to progress through intelligence and character history rather than coincidence. Paul would not need to discover one miraculous piece of evidence. He could slowly dismantle the conspiracy by understanding the people behind it. Paul's first return scene could be quiet rather than explosive. Genoa City would already be in turmoil, with Jack's condition uncertain, Diane under pressure, and Kyle convinced that no one is moving quickly enough. Then Paul could enter the police station or the hospital corridor without warning. The people who know him would immediately understand the significance of his arrival. Christine might be surprised but quietly relieved. Michael might question whether Paul can remain objective when his own sister is involved. Kyle could react with open anger, accusing him of returning far too late. Diane might fear that Paul's loyalty to Patty will make the situation even worse. Paul would accept their distrust because he knows he has not earned the right to demand confidence from them. Instead of making dramatic promises, he would ask for the case files. He would study the timeline, the witness statements, the medical records, the security footage, and every inconsistency surrounding Markham's involvement. The younger Paul might once have believed he could personally control Patty's behavior, but a wiser Paul would understand that love cannot replace accountability. He would not excuse her actions, yet he would refuse to let Markham use her as the only villain. That distinction would immediately create tension. The Abbotts would want Patty punished, while Paul would insist that exposing Markham is the only way to uncover the complete truth. His position would be painful, but logical. Patty must answer for what she has done, but the person who planned, encouraged, or exploited those actions must not escape simply because she is easier to blame. Paul's return could also force Patty to confront reality in a way no other character can. She may dismiss accusations from Jack, Diane, or Kyle as persecution. She may believe that Markham is the only person who truly understands her, especially if he has convinced her that the Abbotts are her enemies and that Paul abandoned her. But seeing Paul again could break through the false reality Markham created. Patty's first reaction might not be relief. It could be rage. She could accuse Paul of leaving her alone, choosing his career and reputation over his sister, and allowing everyone else to define her as a monster. Paul would have to listen without immediately becoming defensive. He might admit that he failed her in ways he did not fully understand at the time, but he would also make it clear that her pain cannot justify what happened to Jack. This confrontation could become one of the strongest scenes in the storyline because neither side would be entirely wrong. Patty has been abandoned, manipulated, and misunderstood, but she has also made dangerous choices that harmed innocent people. Paul loves her, but his love has sometimes caused him to believe he could manage a crisis that required firmer intervention. Their conversation could slowly expose Markham's control. Perhaps Patty repeatedly claims that Markham saved her, only for Paul to ask what he demanded in return. Perhaps she insists that Diane attacked first, but her memory begins to shift when Paul asks precise questions about the sequence of events. Perhaps she becomes visibly terrified when Paul mentions confronting Markham directly. In that moment, Paul would recognize the truth. Patty is not protecting Markham because she trusts him. She is protecting him because she believes he has the power to punish her. Markham, meanwhile, would understand immediately that Paul is the greatest threat he has faced. Kyle is emotional, Michael is legal, Christine is procedural, and Victor may rely on power, but Paul combines patience with deep personal knowledge. He cannot be easily distracted by a false confession or a dramatic accusation. Markham would therefore attempt to turn Paul's history against him. He could leak information about Paul's past mistakes, suggest that Paul is interfering with the investigation to protect his sister, or manipulate the police into questioning Paul's objectivity. This would create a compelling obstacle because Paul could not simply reclaim his former authority and command everyone to follow him. He might no longer hold the official position he once had, and even if he were welcomed back into the investigation, His family connection to Patty would create an obvious conflict of interest. The story would become stronger if Paul had to operate carefully from the outside, using old instincts and trusted relationships while knowing that one wrong move could destroy the case. He might cooperate with Christine while challenging her assumptions, provide Michael with evidence without allowing the defense to hide Patty's responsibility, and attempt to convince Kyle that revenge will only make Markham's plan easier. Each alliance would be uneasy. Paul would be valuable to everyone but completely trusted by no one. Kyle's conflict with Paul could become particularly intense. From Kyle's perspective, Patty nearly destroyed his family. Markham assisted her, and the authorities failed to act quickly enough. Paul's insistence on understanding Patty's motives could sound like another excuse. Kyle might demand that Paul choose a side, but Paul would refuse to accept that argument. He would explain that justice is not weakened by understanding how a crime occurred, it is strengthened by it. Kyle would not accept that answer immediately. He could accuse Paul of protecting his sister, while Jack fights for his life, and Diane faces accusations she does not deserve. Paul might respond that blind anger is exactly what Markham wants, because it makes everyone predictable. This could gradually establish a powerful relationship between the two men. Paul would see a younger man being consumed by the need to protect his parents, while Kyle would see an older man burdened by the consequences of believing he could protect everyone. Their conflict could evolve into reluctant cooperation when Kyle discovers important evidence but is tempted to use it recklessly. Paul could prevent him from confronting Markham alone, explaining that a confession obtained through threats would collapse under legal scrutiny and might put Patty, Diane, or Jack in even greater danger. Kyle would despise the delay, but he would gradually understand that Paul is not weak. He is disciplined, and that discipline may be the only thing keeping Markham from escaping. The investigation itself should unfold through a series of connected discoveries rather than one convenient revelation. Paul could first identify that Markham had access to information about Jack's medical condition before those details became public. That discovery would suggest that someone inside the hospital or close to the family had been feeding Markham information. Paul might then uncover inconsistencies in Markham's professional history, including unexplained gaps in his employment, altered records, or an identity connected to an earlier investigation. None of those discoveries would immediately prove that Markham planned the attack, but together they would show that he had created a false image of authority around Patty. Paul could then revisit locations connected to the crime and notice that evidence supposedly left by Diane had been positioned too neatly, as though someone specifically wanted it to be discovered. He might compare Patty's official statement with security footage and realize that the timing she described was impossible. He could also notice that Markham appeared at several important moments before anyone had contacted him, suggesting that he already knew how events were going to unfold. Eventually, Paul's investigation could lead to a recorded conversation, a hidden medical file, or a message Markham sent to Patty using language identical to the words in her rehearsed testimony. The key would be accumulation. Paul's talent would lie in recognizing the pattern long before anyone else understood what the individual pieces meant. At the same time, Paul's return should not be limited to police work. His presence would reopen emotional wounds throughout Genoa City. Christine would have to confront their complicated history and determine whether she can trust his judgment. Michael might respect Paul's investigative ability but fear that his personal involvement could damage Diane's defense. Jack, once stable enough to speak, might react with bitterness because Patty has threatened his life more than once, and Paul's arrival could feel like another reminder that the Williams family's pain keeps becoming the Abbott family's burden. Diane might be even less forgiving. She has been blamed, hunted, and judged, and she may view Paul's compassion for Patty as an insult to every person his sister has harmed. Paul would have to accept those reactions without demanding forgiveness. His return would matter most if he were forced to earn his place again. He could not simply rely on old friendships, his former title, or his past heroism. He would have to prove through his actions that he is prepared to expose the truth, even if doing so destroys the final illusions he still holds about Patty. Jack's eventual confrontation with Paul could become another important emotional moment. Jack may understand that Markham manipulated Patty, but that knowledge would not erase what she did. He could tell Paul that Genoa City has spent too many years excusing Patty because she was ill, vulnerable, or under someone else's influence. Paul would not disagree. Instead, he might admit that his desire to save his sister sometimes caused him to overlook the danger she presented to others. Jack could then ask the most painful question of all. If Paul had been present earlier, would any of this have happened? Paul would have no honest answer. He could not promise that his presence would have prevented the attack, but he might admit that he should have remained more involved in Patty's treatment and supervision. That admission would demonstrate that he has not returned simply to defend himself. He has returned because he knows that avoiding the past allowed it to repeat itself. Diane's relationship with Paul would be even more complicated because she would have little reason to trust his intentions. From her perspective, Patty's accusations have placed her freedom, marriage, and reputation in danger. Paul could offer evidence that begins clearing her name, but Diane might still question whether he will bury information to protect his sister. Rather than asking Diane to trust him, Paul could give her access to everything he discovers. He could explain that secrecy allowed Markham's manipulation to grow, and that transparency is the only way to prevent another false narrative from taking control. Diane might remain suspicious, but she would begin to see that Paul is not attempting to erase Patty's guilt. He is attempting to establish the precise level of Markham's involvement so that no one can challenge the truth later. Their reluctant cooperation could become essential when Diane remembers a detail about Markham that initially seemed unimportant. A phrase he used, a place where she saw him, or a document he handled before Jack's attack. Paul could use that memory to connect Markham directly to the planted evidence. Meanwhile, Markham would not remain passive while Paul dismantled his plan. He could attempt to provoke another crisis, perhaps by convincing Patty that Paul intends to have her permanently locked away. He might send her a message warning that Paul has betrayed her again, hoping she will panic and either run or lash out. He could also target Jack's medical care, manipulate evidence connected to Diane, or create a false trail leading investigators away from him. Paul would understand that Markham's greatest weapon is not violence, but emotional pressure. He knows how to make people act before they think. Patty attacks because she feels abandoned. Kyle becomes reckless because he fears losing his parents. Diane becomes defensive because she expects to be blamed. Jack becomes furious because his family is threatened. By pushing each person toward an emotional extreme, Markham keeps them from seeing the full pattern. Paul's role would be to slow everyone down long enough to recognize that they are being controlled. The emotional climax could arrive when Paul finally finds Patty before Markham can silence or abandon her. By then, Patty may have realized that she was never Markham's true partner. She was his shield. He used her history, her obsessions, and her instability to create chaos while remaining at a safe distance. Once the investigation begins closing in, he may decide that she is too dangerous to keep alive or too unreliable to remain free. Paul could reach her at the moment she is preparing to escape, surrender, or follow one final instruction from Markham. Rather than depending entirely on a physical confrontation, the scene could be built around trust. Paul would tell Patty that he cannot erase what she has done and cannot promise that she will avoid punishment, but he can promise that Markham will not be allowed to control the ending. Patty would have to choose between the fantasy Markham gave her and the painful truth Paul offers. Her decision could determine whether Jack and Diane are finally cleared, whether Markham escapes, and whether Paul's return becomes a redemption or another tragedy. Patty might agree to cooperate, but the story should not become too simple. Markham could anticipate her betrayal and prepare false evidence, making it appear that Paul coached her testimony. He might arrange for Patty to disappear and then claim that Paul helped her escape. Suddenly, Paul would become a suspect in the very case he is attempting to solve. This twist would force him to confront the darkest interpretation of his history, that everyone expects him to protect Patty regardless of what she has done. To clear his name, Paul would need assistance from the same people who originally doubted him. Kyle might provide footage proving that Paul attempted to stop Patty. Michael could challenge the legal assumptions surrounding the evidence. Christine could risk her reputation by refusing to accept the convenient accusation against Paul. Even Diane might be forced to admit that Paul's investigation uncovered facts no one else could have found. This would bring several characters together without erasing their existing conflicts or forcing them into unrealistic friendships. Paul's return could also create a powerful, moral conflict for Christine. She would understand his investigative instincts better than most people, but she would also know how deeply Patty's case affects him. Christine might initially refuse,